The instinct of kings. There is a truth history rarely speaks aloud. Power does not merely seek control over nations. Eventually, it begins seeking control over people themselves. Their loyalty, their admiration, their bodies, their bloodlines. Ancient emperors built forbidden cities filled with thousands of women. Modern billionaires build empires surrounded by luxury, influence, and endless social access. Different centuries, different architecture. But perhaps the same instinct still breathes underneath both worlds. Because once human beings reach extraordinary heights of power, ordinary limits begin feeling unnatural. And maybe that is where the psychological transformation truly begins. At first, power feels like freedom. Then freedom slowly transforms into entitlement. And eventually, entitlement becomes possession. History often describes emperors owning 3,000 concubines as if it were merely excess. But perhaps it was something darker. A declaration that no beauty, no affection, no human intimacy existed outside imperial reach. The emperor did not simply rule the kingdom. He ruled access itself. Who could be desired? Who could reproduce? Who could belong? And maybe modern civilization quietly repeats the same pattern in more sophisticated forms. Today, the palace walls have become invisible. Glass skyscrapers, private islands, exclusive parties hidden behind wealth and algorithms. Yet the emotional gravity remains strangely familiar. Because money changes attraction, power changes perception, and extreme success creates an environment where desire itself becomes distorted. Perhaps this explains why some of the richest men in modern civilization continue chasing larger families, younger partners, and endless novelty long after achieving unimaginable success. Because maybe power does not reduce human instinct, it amplifies it. Ancient kings feared the extinction of their bloodline. Modern elites fear irrelevance, obsolescence, disappearing from history after death. And perhaps children, relationships, and possession become emotional weapons against that fear, a way to leave fragments of the self behind, to continue existing indirectly through legacy, genetics, and influence. But history also leaves behind a warning. The more power people accumulate, the easier it becomes to confuse admiration with love, access with intimacy, possession with connection. And maybe that is the tragedy, hidden beneath every palace and every luxury tower ever built. Human beings searching desperately for permanence, inside relationships shaped by imbalance. Because perhaps the final hunger of powerful men is not pleasure alone. It is the desire to feel immortal through other human beings. When modern people hear the phrase 3,000 concubines, they often imagine fantasy, pleasure, endless luxury hidden behind palace walls. But perhaps the reality was far colder than the legends suggest. Because the imperial harem was not built merely for desire. It was built for control. Every woman inside the palace became part of a system designed around one man's power, a carefully organized hierarchy where beauty itself was transformed into political structure. Ranks, titles, rules, selection rituals, every detail controlled by the emperor's authority. And perhaps that is what made the Forbidden City so psychologically unsettling. Nothing inside it truly belonged to the women living there. Not their future, not their freedom, not even their ability to love naturally. Because affection inside the palace could never remain simple. Every smile carried ambition. Every pregnancy carried political consequences. Every glance from the emperor could elevate one woman while destroying another. And maybe this reveals something deeply uncomfortable about absolute power. The moment one human being gains unlimited access to others, relationships slowly stop becoming human. They become systems, transactions, symbols reinforcing hierarchy itself. Ancient emperors often measured greatness through expansion. More territory, more wealth, more heirs, more women gathered beneath imperial ownership, because perhaps possession itself became emotional proof of superiority, a visible demonstration that ordinary limits no longer applied to the ruler. And maybe the women inside these palaces understood something history rarely records openly. That luxury is not the same as freedom. Silk robes cannot replace autonomy. Golden walls remain walls. Some concubines spent entire lives waiting for a single moment of attention from the emperor. A glance, a conversation, a possibility of bearing a royal child capable of changing their destiny forever. And perhaps that is where the tragedy of the harem becomes clearest. Thousands of human lives revolving emotionally around one distant figure who could never truly belong to any of them completely. Because power divides attention endlessly. The emperor belonged to the empire first, and everyone else existed somewhere beneath that reality. Maybe this is why the Forbidden City often felt emotionally silent, despite its beauty. And behind the music, jewels, and ceremony, there was constant competition, fear, loneliness, and invisible pressure surrounding every interaction. Because once affection becomes connected to survival, love itself slowly changes shape. And perhaps history's greatest palaces were not simply monuments to wealth. They were monuments to humanity's eternal temptation to confuse possession with connection. Modern civilization likes to believe it escaped the psychology of kings. No more thrones, no more royal bloodlines, no more forbidden cities filled with concubines waiting behind palace walls. At least, that is what we tell ourselves. But perhaps power never truly disappeared. It simply changed clothing. Today's emperors wear black turtlenecks instead of golden crowns. They rule algorithms instead of armies, glass towers instead of stone palaces. And perhaps nowhere is this transformation more visible than in the private lives of the ultra-rich. Because modern billionaires rarely build harems openly. Instead, they build systems protecting freedom itself. Private wealth managers, prenuptial agreements, layers of legal structures surrounding relationships long before love even begins. And maybe this reveals a strange contradiction at the heart of modern elite culture. The richer people become, the more carefully they prepare for emotional collapse. Ancient emperors feared betrayal inside palace walls. Modern billionaires fear losing half their empire inside divorce courts. Different century, same anxiety. Because at extreme levels of wealth, relationships stop existing purely as emotional bonds. They become financial events, strategic risks, potential threats to dynasties built over decades. And perhaps this is why modern love among the ultra-rich often feels strangely corporate. Lawyers before vows, asset negotiations before emotional trust, confidentiality agreements protecting private lives from public destruction. Even intimacy becomes surrounded by contracts. Maybe that is the hidden psychological cost of extraordinary success. The inability to separate human connection from economic consequence. A normal relationship can end with heartbreak. A billionaire relationship can erase fortunes larger than entire nations. And perhaps that pressure slowly changes how people experience affection itself. Because once someone possesses unimaginable wealth, trust becomes difficult. Who truly loves the person, and who loves access to the empire surrounding them? Maybe this explains why modern elite relationships often appear unstable, despite unlimited luxury. Private jets cannot purchase emotional certainty. Yachts cannot guarantee loyalty. and enormous wealth often attracts admiration, powerful enough to imitate genuine affection, convincingly. Ancient kings once isolated themselves behind palace walls because power made ordinary life impossible. Modern billionaires isolate themselves through legal systems, private security, and controlled social circles for remarkably similar reasons. Because the higher people rise, the smaller the circle of trust becomes. And perhaps this is the final irony of modern freedom. The people capable of accessing almost anything in the world often struggle most to experience relationships without fear, calculation, or emotional doubt. Maybe modern civilization did not destroy the psychology of kings. It digitized it. Throughout history, powerful men have always feared one thing more than death itself: the possibility of disappearing without continuation. Ancient kings solved this fear through dynasties: more sons, more heirs, more blood carrying fragments of the ruler into the future. And perhaps modern civilization believed it had evolved beyond such instincts, until figures like Elon Musk began speaking openly about population collapse and the responsibility of intelligent people to reproduce. At first glance, it sounds rational, even scientific, a concern about declining birth rates and the future survival of civilization. But perhaps beneath the logic, something older still exists, an ancient psychological instinct hidden beneath modern language. Because history has seen this pattern before. Not powerful men convincing themselves that their bloodline carries historical importance, that their continuation is somehow connected to humanity's continuation itself. Ancient emperors once believed heaven had chosen their lineage to rule. Modern technological elites sometimes speak as though innovation itself grants a similar responsibility. And perhaps that is what makes this phenomenon so fascinating. The fusion of intelligence, power, ego, and existential fear into one psychological mission. Elon Musk does not hide his desire for a large family. In fact, he often frames reproduction almost as a civilizational duty. And maybe this reveals how differently powerful people experience parenthood. For ordinary families, children are often emotional meaning, love, connection, continuity within a small human life. But for certain powerful individuals, children can also become legacy architecture, a way of extending influence beyond biological death, a human version of colonizing the future itself. Perhaps that is why modern billionaires increasingly speak about humanity in terms of long-term survival. Mars colonies, artificial intelligence, genetic continuation, population engineering. The scale becomes planetary, almost imperial. And maybe that mirrors ancient rulers more closely than modern society feels comfortable admitting. Because emperors once believed their dynasty represented civilization itself. If the bloodline survived, the world remained stable. If it failed, chaos followed. And perhaps some modern elites quietly inherit a similar worldview, that their ideas, genes, or influence must continue expanding outward for humanity to progress. But history also leaves behind an uncomfortable warning. The moment human beings begin viewing themselves as historically necessary, they risk treating ordinary people as secondary characters inside their personal vision of the future. And maybe that is where legacy slowly transforms into ego. Because perhaps no individual, no matter how intelligent or powerful, was ever meant to become civilization's center permanently. Not emperors, not billionaires, not anyone. Still, the desire remains deeply human, to leave something behind, to continue beyond mortality, to feel that some part of the self might survive the silence waiting at the end of every life. And perhaps children become the most emotional form of immortality humanity has ever created, not because they preserve power forever, but because they allow human beings to imagine continuity, even while time keeps moving forward without mercy. Perhaps one of the strangest transformations in modern civilization is how love became something lawyers prepare for. Ancient emperors protected their bloodline with palace walls, royal traditions, and strict hierarchy. Modern billionaires protect their empires with signatures, contracts, clauses, financial safeguards written long before marriage even begins. And maybe that reveals something deeply revealing about the psychology of extreme wealth. Because the richer people become, the more dangerous intimacy starts to feel. To ordinary couples, marriage often represents emotional trust, a leap into uncertainty together. But for the ultra-rich, uncertainty can cost billions, entire corporations, control over decades of accumulated power. And perhaps that is why prenuptial agreements feel emotionally colder than romance itself. Before love fully enters the room, fear is already sitting at the table. Fear of betrayal, fear of manipulation, fear that affection may disappear the moment money changes direction. Ancient rulers once feared outsiders contaminating royal bloodlines. Modern elites fear outsiders gaining access to financial dynasties. Different language, different systems. Yet perhaps the emotional instinct remains remarkably similar. Protection of the empire above all else. And maybe this is why elite relationships often appear carefully engineered rather than naturally formed. Public image management, asset division planning, lawyers negotiating future separation before emotional union even exists. Almost like modern civilization quietly accepts that power and intimacy struggle to coexist peacefully. Because once wealth reaches extraordinary levels, love becomes difficult to separate from economics. A simple argument between ordinary couples may involve feelings. For billionaires, it may involve media headlines, stock value fluctuations, corporate governance, and political consequences. Perhaps that pressure slowly transforms relationships into strategic alliances rather than emotional refuge. And maybe this creates a hidden loneliness modern society rarely discusses openly. The inability to fully relax inside human connection, to trust without calculation, to love without preparing escape routes first. Ancient palaces isolated emperors behind golden walls. Modern legal systems isolate billionaires behind invisible ones. Because both worlds understand the same frightening truth. The more power a person accumulates, the more they fear losing it through intimacy. And perhaps that is the final paradox of enormous wealth. Money creates freedom from ordinary survival, while simultaneously creating fear powerful enough to poison emotional vulnerability itself. Because maybe the ultimate luxury was never yachts or skyscrapers. Maybe it was the ability to trust another human being completely, without needing a contract prepared beforehand. Perhaps one of the most dangerous effects of power is not greed, but adaptation. Because human beings eventually adapt to almost everything. Luxury becomes normal. Admiration becomes expected. Access becomes ordinary. And maybe that is why powerful people so often continue searching for something new, long after achieving more than most humans could ever imagine. Ancient emperors constantly expanded their harems, not because one person was incapable of love, but because power slowly transforms novelty into emotional stimulation. A new concubine, a new face, a new source of fascination temporarily interrupting the emotional numbness created by excess. And perhaps modern civilization quietly repeats the same cycle. Today, the palace has become global. Private jets, luxury islands, elite social circles filled with endless access and infinite possibility. The modern conqueror no longer rides horseback across kingdoms. He scrolls through limitless options inside a world designed to reward impulse and desire continuously. And maybe that changes the human brain more deeply than society wants to admit. Because dopamine was never designed for unlimited abundance. It evolved inside scarcity, inside limitation, inside uncertainty. But power removes barriers. And once barriers disappear, the mind often begins needing stronger stimulation, simply to feel excitement again. Perhaps that is why conquest itself becomes addictive. Not merely sexual conquest, emotional conquest, social conquest. The psychological thrill of proving once again that another person can still be attracted, impressed, or emotionally captured. Ancient kings expanded territory. For the same emotional reason, some modern elites expand relationships endlessly. Validation, confirmation that power still works, that influence still bends reality. And maybe beneath this behavior hides a deeper existential fear, the fear of emotional stillness. Because stillness forces reflection, reflection forces confrontation, and confrontation may reveal something many powerful people spend entire lives avoiding. That no amount of success permanently satisfies the human mind. Perhaps this is why extraordinary power often produces restlessness instead of peace. The conqueror becomes trapped inside his own momentum, always needing another achievement, another thrill, another emotional high powerful enough to briefly overpower emptiness. And maybe this explains why some relationships among the ultra-rich appear strangely temporary, despite immense privilege. Because novelty itself becomes chemically rewarding, while familiarity slowly loses emotional intensity. Ancient palaces once cycled endlessly through new concubines entering royal favor. Modern celebrity culture cycles endlessly through new partners, new scandals, and new obsessions for remarkably similar psychological reasons. Different civilization, same nervous system. And perhaps history quietly warns us about something modern society rarely discusses honestly. Human desire without limitation does not create fulfillment. It creates escalation. Because once the brain becomes accustomed to abundance, ordinary emotional connection may begin feeling insufficient. And maybe that is the final tragedy of the conqueror mindset. The endless pursuit of stimulation slowly destroys the ability to appreciate simplicity. Until eventually, the person capable of accessing almost everything can no longer truly feel satisfied by anything for very long. Perhaps history rarely tells us what happens after powerful men finally obtain everything they once desired. The kingdoms, the admiration, the wealth, the freedom to choose almost anyone and go almost anywhere. Because eventually, after enough conquest, silence begins entering the room. Ancient emperors surrounded themselves with thousands of people, yet many died emotionally isolated behind palace walls. And perhaps modern billionaires quietly experience a similar loneliness beneath different architecture. Because the higher someone rises, the harder it becomes to trust human affection completely. Bill Gates ended a marriage lasting nearly 3 decades. Jeff Bezos separated from the woman who stood beside him before unimaginable wealth arrived. And maybe what makes these stories emotionally haunting is not the money involved. It is the collapse of certainty, the realization that even enormous success cannot permanently secure human connection. Perhaps ordinary people often misunderstand loneliness. They imagine loneliness as physical isolation. But maybe the deepest form of loneliness happens when a person is constantly surrounded by others, yet never fully certain who truly sees them beyond status and power. Ancient rulers feared betrayal inside palace walls because everyone near them needed something. Modern elites often fear the same thing: access to wealth, influence, opportunity, security. And perhaps this constant uncertainty slowly damages emotional intimacy itself, because trust requires vulnerability. But vulnerability becomes dangerous when billions of dollars, global influence, and public reputation are attached to every relationship. Maybe this is why powerful men sometimes appear emotionally guarded, even inside love itself. Not because they feel less emotion, but because they fear emotional exposure more intensely than ordinary people can imagine. After enough success, people stop approaching you naturally. Every interaction begins carrying invisible weight: calculation, expectation, performance. And perhaps this creates a strange emotional paradox. The people most admired publicly may feel the least understood privately. Ancient emperors once isolated themselves inside forbidden cities for protection. Modern billionaires isolate themselves through private estates, security teams, and controlled social environments. Different century, same emotional architecture, because power attracts people constantly, while simultaneously making genuine connection harder to recognize. And maybe that is why some of the wealthiest individuals on Earth continue searching endlessly for emotional certainty they never fully find. Another relationship, another beginning, another attempt to feel understood beyond status. But history quietly leaves behind a painful lesson. Human beings can purchase loyalty temporarily, attention temporarily, admiration temporarily. But genuine emotional safety cannot be forced into existence through power, because love becomes fragile the moment fear enters it. And perhaps that is the hidden emotional cost of ruling any empire: the gradual realization that the world may desire your power far more than it desires your humanity. Ancient harems were built with walls, guards, rules. Women inside them often had little choice. Modern civilization tells itself that world disappeared, and in many ways, it did. But perhaps power simply discovered a more sophisticated form of attraction, one without chains, one without prison gates, one where desire becomes voluntary. Today, no emperor forces thousands of women into forbidden cities. Instead, millions voluntarily compete for visibility inside digital spaces shaped by wealth, beauty, and status. And maybe that is what makes modern civilization psychologically fascinating. Because the new harem does not operate through coercion alone. It operates through aspiration. Social media transformed attention into currency, beauty into algorithmic power, visibility into economic opportunity. And perhaps nowhere is this more visible than around the ultra-rich. Luxury lifestyles, private jets, exclusive parties, endless online fascination surrounding billionaires and celebrity elites. The modern palace no longer hides behind ancient walls. It broadcasts itself globally every second. And maybe this changes human behavior more deeply than we fully understand, because attraction itself begins adapting to digital competition. Ancient concubines once competed for imperial favor inside palace corridors. Modern influencers compete for elite attention across millions of screens simultaneously. Different civilization, same psychological gravity, pulling human desire toward power. Perhaps this is why social media often feels strangely exhausting emotionally. Everyone performing, curating, optimizing themselves for validation and visibility. Because in environments shaped by status, human beings slowly begin transforming themselves into products. Ancient palace women perfected beauty rituals to survive inside hierarchy. Modern digital culture rewards similar behavior through likes, followers, and financial opportunity. And maybe this creates a dangerous illusion of freedom, because voluntary participation can still be shaped by invisible systems of power, algorithms, economics, social aspiration, the emotional promise that proximity to wealth might transform one's entire life. Perhaps this is why modern billionaires and celebrities often become centers of digital worship, far beyond ordinary admiration. People are not only attracted to the person, they are attracted to the fantasy orbiting around the person. Security, luxury, escape from ordinary existence, and maybe that fantasy becomes powerful enough to reshape entire industries of beauty, dating, and identity itself. But history quietly warns us about something uncomfortable. Whenever human beings begin competing intensely for access to power, authenticity often becomes the first sacrifice. Because survival inside status systems rewards performance more than sincerity. Ancient palace politics demanded emotional masks. Modern digital culture often demands them too. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all this is that nobody needed to force the system anymore. Human beings entered it willingly, because maybe the strongest form of control was never physical imprisonment. Perhaps it was convincing people to voluntarily reshape themselves for the approval of power. Perhaps every civilization eventually asks the same question. What truly survives after powerful people disappear? Ancient kings believed the answer was bloodline. More sons, more heirs, more branches extending the dynasty beyond death itself. Because to rulers of the ancient world, children were not only family, they were insurance against oblivion. A king with one heir risked extinction. A king with many heirs believed his name might echo across centuries. And maybe modern billionaires quietly carry a similar instinct beneath more sophisticated language. Today they speak about innovation, impact, civilization, the future of humanity. But perhaps underneath all those grand ideas still exists a deeply ancient human desire to continue existing through something that outlives the body. Some pursue it through children, others through corporations, technologies, foundations, digital systems designed to preserve influence long after death arrives. And maybe this reveals something emotionally universal about human beings. We struggle to accept impermanence. Ancient emperors built monuments large enough to challenge time itself. Modern elites build companies powerful enough to shape generations after they are gone. Different materials, same psychological longing, the desire to leave fingerprints on the future. But history quietly teaches something uncomfortable. Bloodlines fade, empires collapse. Even great dynasties eventually become paragraphs inside history books. The children of kings often fought one another. The heirs of enormous fortunes sometimes destroyed what previous generations built. And perhaps this is why legacy remains one of the most emotionally fragile ideas in human civilization. Because control ends the moment life ends. No empire remains perfectly protected forever. Not ancient kingdoms, not modern corporations, not family names. And maybe the greatest illusion powerful people believe is that enough wealth or enough descendants can permanently defeat forgetting. But history remembers strangely. Some rulers with thousands of heirs vanished emotionally from collective memory, while others with no children transformed humanity through ideas alone. Perhaps legacy was never truly about genetic survival. Maybe it was always about human impact, compassion, wisdom, contribution. The invisible emotional marks left behind inside other people's lives. Ancient rulers feared dying without heirs because they feared disappearing completely. Modern billionaires often fear irrelevance for the same reason. And maybe beneath all ambition hides the same quiet human prayer. Please do not let me vanish without meaning. But perhaps history's deepest lesson is this. A person's greatest legacy is rarely the size of the empire they controlled. It is the emotional consequences they leave behind after power disappears. Because eventually, every fortune becomes someone else's property. Every throne becomes empty. Every corporation changes hands. And in the end, human beings are remembered less for what they possessed and more for what they changed inside the human story itself. Perhaps after thousands of years of history, humanity still has not solved its oldest emotional contradiction, the desire to possess everything while still longing to be loved sincerely. Ancient emperors filled forbidden cities with thousands of people. Modern billionaires fill their lives with wealth, movement, influence, and endless access. Yet both worlds often arrive at the same quiet destination, emotional uncertainty, because power can command attention, but it cannot guarantee genuine connection. A king could order loyalty. A billionaire can purchase admiration. But neither can fully control what another human heart truly feels. And maybe that is why history feels strangely repetitive across centuries. Different clothing, different technology, different architecture. Yet the same emotional hunger continues echoing through human civilization. The desire to matter beyond death, to leave behind bloodlines, dynasties, children, empires, something capable of whispering, "I was here." Perhaps that is why powerful men throughout history pursued both conquest and intimacy with such intensity. Because deep beneath ambition often hides fear. Fear of irrelevance, fear of emotional abandonment, fear that all achievement may ultimately disappear into silence. Ancient rulers once believed giant palaces and endless heirs could protect them from forgetting. Modern elites often believe technology, fame, or financial empires might achieve the same thing. But history quietly removes every illusion eventually. Empires collapse, fortunes dissolve, family names fade. Even monuments slowly surrender to time. And perhaps this leaves humanity facing one final uncomfortable question. If power cannot create permanent meaning, then what can? Maybe the answer was never possession. Maybe it was connection. Not domination over people, but genuine impact within them. Because history rarely remembers who owned the largest bedroom, the largest palace, or the largest bank account emotionally. It remembers who changed human lives, who relieved suffering, who created wisdom, who left warmth behind instead of fear. And perhaps that is the hidden tragedy inside so many stories of enormous power. People spend entire lifetimes expanding external empires while neglecting the fragile emotional world inside themselves. The heart hidden inside the golden chest, still uncertain, still searching, and still afraid of being unloved despite possessing almost everything. Perhaps this is why some ordinary people living quiet lives ultimately appear more emotionally fulfilled than kings. Because peace does not always grow from abundance. Sometimes it grows from sincerity, from trust, from emotional safety impossible to purchase with wealth alone. And maybe that is the final lesson history leaves for all of us. Human beings may conquer nations, build corporations, accumulate unimaginable fortunes. But in the end, the most valuable thing a person can leave behind is not ownership. It is love that remained genuine even after power disappeared.